Finding your way back to God is a life-changing moment and a life-giving process. And that means that if you've never found your way back to God, you can do that today and it can change everything. It also means that if you know Christ and you're walking with Him, but your life is, so something's amiss, you're feeling empty, that you can find your way back to Him again and you can experience the fellowship and relationship that is available in Him. We only come to Christ and receive forgiveness of our sins once, but in this walk with the Lord, there are many times that we feel like the relationship has grown distant or cold, and we need to find our way back to God again. And so whether you need to find your way back to God for the first time today, or you need to find your way back to God again this morning, I hope that this message will make a difference in your heart and life. Because finding our way back to God is incredibly important. We know that because something we've tried to emphasize in every one of these messages is that our longings for love and purpose and meaning can only be fulfilled in a relationship with God. The things that our heart desires can only be found in a relationship with God. Those things that you search the world over, you will only find what it is that you're looking for if you know God, if you have a relationship with Him. And today we're going to talk about one of those longings in particular, the longing for love. The desire that our hearts have for love and the place where an incredible wealth of love can be found. You see, when we talk about the Son coming back to the Father, and last week we looked at the Father running to Him and accepting Him and welcoming Him, I want you to realize today that the reason that we are accepted and welcomed is because we are loved. And when we find our way back to God, we discover our identity as a deeply loved, unconditionally accepted, welcomed child of God. In the book, Finding Your Way Back to God, John Ferguson tells a story about his friend Jim and Jim's wife Lori. They went on a cruise to the Bahamas. And Jim won this cruise because he was one of the top producers in their company. And so he was on this cruise with several of his co-workers and his boss. They had a wonderful cruise, and on the last day, that morning, early in the morning, the cruise ship docked back in Fort Lauderdale, and Jim and Lori were waking up and getting ready to get dressed and head off of the plane and make their way back home when there was a knock at the door. And Lori, because they were still getting dressed, she just kind of cracked the door a little bit, and the door flung open, and 6 DEA agents stormed in, and they came to Jim, who was sitting there on the edge of his bed, still not dressed yet, and said, "You are under arrest. We have warrants for your arrest in 6 states. And the charge on each one of those warrants is trafficking cocaine." Now, Jim knew immediately that they had the wrong guy. He'd never been around cocaine, but the DEA agents didn't believe him. And it took 2 hours in their office to convince them that they had the wrong Jim. As it turned out, his identity had been stolen. Someone got his Social Security number and opened up credit cards in his name and also committed several crimes. Finally, he convinced them that he was not the cocaine trafficking Jim that they were looking for, and he was released. But that was just the beginning of that situation. Because then he had to hire attorneys to clear his name, to get his debts removed, and then he had to go back to work and tell everyone that he worked with why he was hauled off of the ship in handcuffs by DEA agents. His identity had been stolen, but more than that, his good name was dragged through the mud. And it may be here that there's some of you that's happened to you. Your identity has been stolen. I'm not necessarily talking about the fact that someone's opened up credit cards in your name, but maybe today you're not living by your true identity because you're simply living under the identity that's been assigned to you by our culture. You're living under the identity that our world has assigned to you. You're living under the idea that you have to be this person that everyone expects you to be. A couple of weeks ago, I talked to you about the cycle of longing and regret, and how longing leads to regret. Regret leads back to deeper longing, which leads to greater regret. And that cycle just goes on in an endless loop, and while we're on that loop, we get confused, sick, the pain and regret begins to mount up. And many people, when they're in this cycle, they lose sight of who they truly are. They lose their identity. They lose who they are. And I want you to see this happen to the son in this story. The story of the prodigal son, the lost son. He lost his identity. And even when he came back home, and even when the father ran to embrace him, he didn't grasp his identity. Look at verse 19. In verse 19, the son has realized his mistake. He's come home. In verse 19, he's speaking to the father, and he says, I am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants. That's the statement that he's saying he's going to tell his father. Verse 20 says, and he arose and came to his father, but when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. Verse 21, he recites that statement that he's practiced, and the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. He says, I recognize I'm no longer worthy to be your son. That's not who I am anymore, but I'm asking you to accept me as a hired hand, accept me as a servant or a slave here on your farm. And the father's response in verse 22 is important. The transition here to that next sentence. But the father said to his servants, bring forth the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring hither the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. And I want you to catch this first phrase of verse 24. For this my son was dead and is alive again, was lost and is found. He calls him his son. He says, this my son. Even after seeing his father run to him and hug him and kiss him, even after he saw his father extending grace to him, this son didn't feel that he was worthy to be called a son. And so he begins that speech, Father, I realize that I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father gives him some significant gifts, and then the father calls him his son anyway. You see, even after the unmistakable signs of the father's love and his grace, the son didn't feel worthy to be a son. And it may be that you're here today and that's exactly where you're at. Even though you have heard the story of the gospel, even though you've heard the story of God's grace, you don't feel worthy to be called a child of God. You don't feel like that's your true identity. You don't feel like that fits you because of the life that you've lived and the decisions that you've made. Even though God has shown you an incredible amount of grace, you don't feel worthy to be called a child of God. Your cycle of longing and regret and the decisions that you made have left you with a lot of pain, a lot of shame. You know, the prodigal son in our story was filled with shame. And that shame followed him home. And it cast a shadow over this homecoming, over this reception. Even though he was welcomed with open arms, he still felt this shame for the things that he had done. I want you to know that shame tries to cast a shadow over everything that God does in our lives. That even when God is working in our hearts and in our lives, that it tries to cast a shadow over our homecoming, over the work that He's doing in our lives, over the difference that He's making in us. It tries to hide the fact that God has made an incredible difference in us from a few years ago. It tries to hide the fact that God has done incredible things to bring us to this point, and it tries to point at all of the mistakes that we've made. And shame lies to us. Shame tells us that we're not worthy, that we don't belong there, that we're not who God says we are. Shame whispers to us, who are you kidding? You don't deserve this. Shame tries to keep us in our past. Shame tries to keep us from embracing our true identity. But in verse 22, the Father gives the Son 3 gifts. And they're not just gifts of kindness, they're gifts of great significance. First of all, He says, bring the best robe and put it on him. Now, a robe is a symbol of rest. Now, you shouldn't picture a bathrobe. A bathrobe, that's typically just what you wear when you're sick, right? It wasn't a bathrobe. But this was a garment that would be worn to a social event. This is a garment that he would have put on to go and eat with family and friends or neighbors. This is something that he would have worn relaxing around the house or spending time with people that he cared about. This was not a garment that he would have worn to the barn or out into the field to work. This wasn't a garment to earn his way back into good graces with the Father. This was a garment welcoming him home to rest. Often when people come to God, they come to Him in desperation and they try to make a deal with God like this son was trying to make a deal with the Father. Just let me come back and I'll work as a slave or as a servant. In the book Unbroken, Louis Zamperini is in a prison camp and he is going through an incredibly torturous situation. And he says, God, if you bring me home from this camp alive, I promise that I will live a good life and be a good man. But when he gets home alive and he remembers his commitment, he can't keep it. He tries to be a good man, but he can't. He's haunted by nightmares and he's plagued by rage. He drinks to forget the things that he went through in that prison camp. He nearly destroys his marriage. And he wants to keep that commitment that he made to God in desperation to do good and to be a good man, but he can't. But then because his wife pesters him, he goes to a Billy Graham crusade in Los Angeles. And he accepts God's grace into his life. And the Father says, rest. And if you're here today and you're trying to work hard at doing good, you're trying to work hard at being different, friend, you don't have to earn your way back into God's good graces. You can't work for it. He is not offering you some clothes to go out in the field and work in. He's not giving you some tools to go and earn your way back onto the farm. He is offering you a robe of rest. He's saying, welcome, come and rest in my grace and love and acceptance. You see, this is what happens to us. God offers us a robe of rest and welcome. The Father says, bring the best robe and put it on him. The best robe in the house would have been the Father's robe. So when they went and they got the best robe in the house, they brought the Father's robe and put it on the Son. And friend, that's what God has done for us. He has offered us His robe, His welcome, because He has worked and done for us what we could not do for ourselves. Can you imagine this morning what would it feel like to be enveloped by the Father's robe? To be able to say, I don't have to run anymore. I don't have to work anymore. I don't have to try to prove myself anymore. I have been welcomed home. I don't have to strive anymore. I'm home. I can rest. We all know what it's like to come home after a long day and finally be able to rest. We know what it's like to come home after a long journey and be able to rest. That's what this son was being offered when they gave him this robe. You're home. You can rest. He said, put the best robe on him and put a ring on his hand. Now, the ring was a symbol of authority. In these cultures, when you came before a king, if you wanted to show respect for his authority and power, you could kiss his ring. And that was the way that you showed respect for his authority. Oftentimes, the king's ring was also his seal. It was the way that he put his authority onto a document. When he wrote some letter or some important document, he would put some wax there at the bottom that was hot and was starting to cool, or put it on the fold of the letter, take his ring and press it into the wax to leave the mark of his ring, so that that document would carry his mark of authority. So when the Father says, put a ring on his hand, He's saying, give him the authority of the household. Give him a mark that shows that he is a part of the family, that he carries the authority of our family name. This son, with that ring, he could go to anyone and he could make a commitment to buy something. He could take out a loan because it has the guarantee of the Father. It would be like giving a credit card to your son or daughter and saying, whatever you need, you can purchase it. And some of you shudder at the thought of doing that, right? You give it to maybe some of your kids, but that one kid, no way. And here's this son. He is without any money. and in a pig pen, starving. And now he has this ring that he can get whatever it is that he could need or want. It's a sign of authority and security. This ring said that he was a child of the King. Put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. These shoes or sandals would have been another sign of acceptance. So most likely this son, he didn't have any shoes when he came home. Shoes were a luxury, not a necessity in that day. And if he had had any shoes when he ran out of money, he probably would have sold them during the famine. And if he didn't sell them, they had probably been ruined or worn out. So when he came home, he most likely came home barefoot. And the father wasn't just providing him with something that he needed, but this was also a sign that he was welcomed as a son, as a member of the family, because slaves didn't wear shoes in the house. But this son was given a pair of shoes and welcomed into the house. When the father gave his son some shoes to wear, he was saying, you are welcome here not as a slave or as a hired hand. You are welcomed here as my son. You're welcomed as part of the family. Now, as much as these gifts must have meant to the son, and as much as that sign of the father running to meet him and greet him and embrace him and kiss him, as much as all of that must have meant to the son, if he hadn't broken down yet, I would think that in verse 24 he would have. It would have just been too much. Because he says, Dad, I know that I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But when the father turns to his servant, he says, my son is home. My son who was lost has been found. And friend, I want you to see that God has given you gifts that indicate your identity as a son or a daughter. God has brought things into your life because He wants you to see that you are welcome home. But it's not just that He's given you things. I want you to see what it is that He calls you. He calls you His son. He calls you His daughter. God looks at you and He says, welcome home, my son. Welcome home, my daughter. And there's a good chance that today you don't feel good enough. You don't feel like you measure up. You don't feel like you're thin enough, or pretty enough, or strong enough, or smart enough, or rich enough, or charming enough. But no matter what labels the world and this culture, no matter what labels Satan himself has put on us and accused us of, the Father calls us sons and daughters. While the world tells us that we've been gone too long and we went too far and we've waited too late, the Father says, welcome home. And these lies that we hear, these lies that tell us that we've messed up, that we've been messed up, these lies that tell us that we're not good enough, over time they begin to impact the way that we think and the way that we feel. And unfortunately, we often give a whole lot of weight to the way that we feel, even when we haven't gotten to the root reason why we feel that way. Have you ever said something like, I just don't have a good feeling about this? Why? I don't know. I just got a feeling. Well, what's that about? I can't tell you what it's about, but I can just tell you this doesn't feel right. And we put a whole lot of weight in the way that we feel, even when we're not sure where those feelings have come from. And I bet that there are people here this morning that you don't feel like a child of God, even though He says you're a child of God. You don't feel that you're welcome home, even though He says that you're welcome home. In the book, Ferguson quotes Henry Nouwen, and I don't agree with everything that Henry Nouwen says or thinks, but I felt like this was appropriate and I didn't want to steal it, so I'm just telling you who said it. He said, every time you feel hurt, offended, rejected, disappointed, you have to dare to say to yourself, these feelings, as strong as they may be, are not telling me the truth. The truth, even though I cannot feel it right now. is that I am a chosen child of God, precious in God's eyes, and called beloved from all eternity. The Father looks at you and says, my son who was lost is found. My daughter who was dead is alive again. And that is the truth, no matter how you feel. When the son came home, he didn't feel worthy to be called a son, but the Father called him a son anyway because He loved him. No matter what lies that this world or your shame have told you, I want you to hear the truth that the Father speaks. Galatians 3:26 says, for in Christ Jesus you are all sons of God through faith. 2 Corinthians 6:18, I will be a father to you, and you shall be sons and daughters to me, says the Lord Almighty. 1 John 3:1, behold what manner of love the Father hath bestowed upon us, that we should be called what? The sons of God. Romans 8:14-16, for as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. For ye have not received the spirit of bondage again to fear, but ye have received the spirit of adoption, whereby we cry, Abba, Father. And the Spirit beareth witness with our spirit that we are children of God. John 1:12-13, but as many as received Him, to them gave He the power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on His name, which were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And friend, you are a child of God today, not because you were born into the right family, not because you've done the right things, not because I say so, or some person with a degree says so, or some person in a room says so, because God says so. Because of the will of God, we are made children of God in faith. You are a child of God, so when you come home, you will be welcome as a member of the family. If you're still unconvinced, know this, that everything the Father gave to the Son came as a direct sacrifice to Himself. The robe, the best robe that they put on Him, that was His robe. The shoes, they got them from His house. The ring, it was a sign of His authority. And everything the Father gave came as a direct sacrifice of Himself to give to the Son. And that's what God has done for us. He has sacrificed to give unto us, to show us that we are welcome, that we are accepted. That's what Christ did for us. He came and gave us gifts and gave us grace. When Ephesians says that we're not saved through works, but it is the gift of God, that is a gift that God has given us to show us His great love for us. The list of your mistakes and my mistakes, it's long. The list of our sins, it goes on and on. And if justice was going to be served, there had to be a punishment for that sin. So Christ came and He took that punishment for us on the cross. He made the sacrifice so that He could welcome us home and justice could be served. That's what He did for us. Why? Because He loves us that much. And you see, your identity isn't based on what you've done. In God's eyes, your identity is based on how much He loves you. I'm reminded of a story that I heard about a grandfather. This grandfather found him in a situation that many of you grandparents have probably found yourselves in. Grandfather stopped by to see his grandson one afternoon on his way home from work. And when he came in the door, he saw his grandson in the playpen crying. And the grandson said, "Out, Grandpa, out!" And the grandpa looked down at him, tears streaming down his little face. "Out, Grandpa, out!" And so instinctively, he stooped down to pick up his grandson. But as he did, his daughter, the little boy's mother, said, "No, Dad, he's in trouble. He's been a bad boy. He's got to sit in the playpen for 5 minutes and time out." So the grandpa started to lower the boy back into the playpen. And you know what happened. The boy screamed and sobbed, "Out, Grandpa, out!" And the grandpa found himself caught between his love for his grandson, the pity that he had on him, and the rules that had been set by his cruel mother. He was caught between his love for his grandson and the laws of the land. So he did the only thing that he could do. He climbed into the playpen and held his grandson. And friend, don't you see that's what God did for us? He saw us stuck between His love for us and the justice that needed to be served on sin. So He climbed into our world to embrace us. He stepped into our mess to hold us, to say, rest. That little boy's mother has said, he's been a bad boy, and he's got to sit in timeout. When that grandfather climbed into that playpen and he held his grandson, he said, you're not a bad boy. You're my boy. And that's what the Father says to us. This is my son who was lost and is found. This is my daughter who was dead and is alive again. You see, in His love, our true identity is uncovered. No matter what the world says about us, no matter what it labels us, what matters in the end is what God calls us. You're a son, you're a daughter. Will you come home to Him? Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer.